Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
What is behind the mind-wrenching phenomenon of demonic possession? To help those who are afflicted, do we turn to religion, medicine, physics, or all three? Are demons what they appear to be?
Hello, and welcome to the 981st edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, coming to you from WOON, AM and FM radio in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, on the Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live, on YouTube, and via TuneIn.com. I'm Ben, and that was Paul, and today we bring you a distinguished guest on a topic of great interest. And if you have any questions or comments, call us from anywhere at 401-766-1240, or email Paul at BehindTheParanormal.com.
Well, very disappointingly, we have not been able to reach the guest, but hopefully he will call in momentarily, but I will introduce him. A graduate of Princeton University who earned his medical degree at Yale, Dr. Richard Gallagher is a board-certified psychiatrist, professor of clinical psychiatry at New York Medical College, and is on the faculty of the Psychoanalytic Institute of Columbia University. Fighting demons wasn't part of his career plan while he was studying medicine at Yale. He knew about biblical accounts of demonic possession, but thought they were an ancient culture's attempt to grapple with mental disorders like epilepsy. He firmly considers himself a man of science, but he has become the go-to guy for American exorcists. He has seen overwhelming evidence that demonic possession is real. He is the author of Demonic Foes, My 25 Years as a Psychiatrist Investigating Possessions, Diabolical Attacks, and the Paranormal. And we certainly would have been honored to have him today, but and again, hopefully he will call in via Zoom. Well,
I mean, it's one of those things. I was very much looking forward to this because I always think it's really interesting because modern cosmology is so odd because everything's very what's the word? Nothing's really connected. It's all kind of like bits and pieces of the same thing. And there's this one quote. I forget if it was from C.S. Lewis, but it was in a lecture I heard a while ago that was like any sort of generation of like, let's say, in this case we'll say Christian has kind of come up with their own sort of way for how demons are. And it's always something they hate the most, typically. Mm-hmm. So, like, you have the medieval sort of, like, torture and stuff like that. And then you have, ranges from everything from us to, like, from that to, like, C.S. Lewis and his sort of version of them as, like, bureaucrats. And in Screw Tape Letters, like, something the most diabolical thing you could think of, bureaucrats. Huh. And so it's kind of funny that they're viewed so differently. So I'm always interested in how it's interpreted. And I was actually very excited to hear someone who's a clinical psychologist talk about it.
Yes. Well, we have about 500 questions based on his book, plus we have listener questions as well.
Every time, huh?
So we would have had, hopefully we'll have him on and probably take several shows just to get through the question. I did, as we always do with guests we don't know, I had a long and stimulating conversation with him a few weeks ago before we booked him. And I was very impressed by several things. First of all, and this is going to sound terribly conceited, but the fact is that with more than half a century of doing this, we don't often have guests who have more experience than I do. But he has a lot more experience than I do with exorcisms. My last knockdown, drag-out exorcisms were in the 1970s when I was a student for the priesthood and was assisting a priest in upstate New York at a psychiatric hospital where there were issues. And Dr. Gallagher has started his career at this, but he didn't expect to. But he was a practicing psychiatrist and educator. And all of a sudden, a priest appeared at his door. In the book, he refers to him as Father Jacques, with a a woman who was judged to be possessed eventually. And one of the reasons it's important to have someone like Dr. Gallagher involved in a case like that is that you have to make sure that the person is not just having a psychiatric episode or series of episodes. That's why in the seminary in upstate New York in the 1970s, the academic dean and the faculty who were surprisingly open to my assisting or at least studying these phenomena set up special courses for me in abnormal psychology. The idea being that you can separate presumably people who are bonkers from people who are having actual paranormal experiences or demonic experiences. But I found that it wasn't that simple. There seemed to be cases where psychiatric illness was intertwined with the paranormal situations. And we need to watch that for when he...
I mean, you can see it on here.
Well, you can? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Just checking the techniques of it. So it was a real education. I don't think you can let him in.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Hold on.
All right. Well, anyway, sorry for the confusion. Live radio, anything can happen. But so I found it was much more complex than even they suspected. It was interesting in oh, he's there?
He's here.
Oh, that's great. Okay, we making sure we have him here. And did you admit him?
I did.
Very good. Dr. Gallagher, are you with us? Okay, better turn him up.
Oh, yeah. There we go. That would probably be helpful, huh?
Very good. You had us chewing our fingernails here, and I was attempting to...
Just in the nick of time, thanks. I'm coming back from the hospital.
Oh, okay. Well, I hope you're okay.
No, it's not me. I still work in the hospital.
Oh, okay. Very good. Well, why don't we begin with something that really jumped out at me. A number of things in your book did, but something that I think is very important. Here's a quote from your introduction. The field of exorcism is littered with examples of careless deliverance groups and lay amateurs who may use questionable and outright hazardous forms of, quote, liberation on people who are struggling with depression or another form of mental illness. Can you comment on that?
Well, Paul, as you know, I'm Catholic, and the Catholic Church tends to be pretty rigorous about making assessments and discernments, but that's not the case in all among all clergy, Catholic and otherwise, but especially in some of the more fundamentalist denominations. They often interpret mental illness or even people's imaginations or people's struggle with evil or a personality disorder, for instance, as demonic, and it can cause a lot of harm when you misdiagnose people. So we always insist on very rigorous discernments. Some people who are psychotic, some people who are multiple personality disorder or different personality disorders in general can easily be mistaken. Now, in a lot of cases, it just sort of wastes everybody's time. But in some cases, it really throws off people for quite a while. And obviously, in rare cases, and admittedly rare, there are these cases where there are outright abuses and people actually get harmed in exorcisms. So it's not for the faint-hearted. One has to use a lot of rigor in one's discernment, just as a doctor would.
Okay. Ben, why don't we go back to the script and you take your first question, please?
Sure. Well, first thing, Dr. Gallagher, thank you so much for being with us, and welcome to Behind the Paranormal. So please tell us about the first case that Father Jacques, as you call him in the book, brought you in on, and that helped lead you into this field.
Well, you've obviously read the book, so thank you. It was published by HarperCollins, called Demonic Foes, and I was very pleased that they let me write a serious book the way I wanted to write it. And in the book, I tell the story of how I got involved in this field. I always kind of tell people I never volunteered. I never volunteered for anything. Originally, I was asked to help out Father Jacques, who came to my office when I was at Cornell Medical College. And he said, Dr. Gallagher, I want to introduce myself. And he introduced himself as an exorcist. And he basically said, I'd be interested in knowing if you would be willing to evaluate some tricky cases we have. We want to make sure that we're not dealing with a medical or a psychiatric illness. I just finished my psychiatric training at Yale. I had some training in internal medicine as well. And I was, quite frankly, kind of skeptical of that sort of thing. In the field of psychiatry, we had been just through, or sort of still in the midst of, a period that we called, you guys may be familiar with it, called the Satanic Panic, where people were seeing Satanists all over the place. And I said, so with all due respect, Father, I'm a little skeptical of the overdiagnosing of some of that stuff in our country. And I remember him saying, well, then you're the perfect man for the job, which kind of took me aback a little bit. And then ever since, I've evaluated many, many cases, mostly people that clergy of different denominations and different faiths have sent me. Sometimes, certainly non-Christian faiths as well. And my chairman, who wrote the preface to my book, and was a believing Catholic himself, said, I probably have seen more of these cases than any other physician in the world. But I still want to emphasize that these cases are rare. I just have had a lot of experience because at this point, people come to see me. Anyway, the case that that Father Jacques, as you call him, I use pseudonyms for all these people, by the way. Everything else in the book is completely accurate, but as to details, but I obviously disguised their identity, and that includes Father Jacques, who was a well-known exorcist that many people know. Anyway, he sent me this woman who claims she was being beaten up by invisible spirits, and she had bruises all over her body. We did some medical tests. We couldn't really find anything to explain that. And her story appeared to be very credible, that she would be lying in bed and all of a sudden, in the face of onlookers and her family, these bruises would appear. So we certainly wanted to do some tests, like for her platelets, that sort of thing. She went to a hematologist. We made sure that there was nothing medical going on. And what I had to do, which was sort of my job, was to tell the priest, well, there doesn't seem to be any medical or psychiatric reason why these bruises are appearing, and her story, confirmed by a number of other people, seemed to be very credible. And he said to me, well, thank you, Dr. Gallagher, that's what I thought. This is what we call not a possession, but this is what we call an oppression. And I began to become familiar with the different terminology, oppression being sort of a more attenuated form of demonic attack as opposed to a possession, of which I've also seen very, very many in the years since.
Okay. Now, we had a fascinating conversation off the air before you came on the show. actually a few weeks ago. Excuse me. And I was noting to Ben that it's not often on the show, and this is going to sound terribly conceited, that we have someone who has more experience than I do. But you do in this field. My experience with exorcisms was pretty much limited to the 70s, with a few exceptions. But we do believe we have encountered and do all the time these demonic entities that we refer to as energy parasites. So, and we had a fascinating discussion on that. But what is a demon?
Well, you're right, Paul. You and I have talked. I know that you have a fair amount of experience. I just got this experience again because I'm a physician and because so many people have approached me over the years. These are not patients of mine, by the way. I don't go around diagnosing typical patients as possessed at all. I've never done that because it's rare enough. So yes, I've had a lot of experience, and for a number of different reasons, which we could go into if you want, for a number of different reasons, I have come to the conclusion that the traditional teaching, which I know you've been exposed to, although you may have your doubts about, that these evil spirits are in fact, as according to Christian theology, fallen angels. They rebelled against God. They seem to hate God, and they indirectly appear to attack human beings for their own sadistic purposes. One of the reasons I believe that, Paul, is because in my experience with successful exorcisms, I'm obviously not an exorcist, even though I'm the longest standing member of the American Society, the International Society of Exorcists, as a scientific advisor, but I'm not an exorcist myself. But I've attended many exorcisms, and what I find is that under duress, in other words, under the commands of the exorcist, which is ultimately under the command of our Lord, because no good exorcist is going to say that he does this on his own. They're basically saying they're doing it by the power of our Lord delegated to them. And these creatures, who often identify themselves as deceased souls, dead relatives, sometimes, believe it or not, even gods and goddesses, which I assume they did throughout ancient history, they are forced to admit that they are evil spirits, and they generally have to reveal their name. And they do admit that they are spirits that have rebelled against God and hate God. So I think it's a pretty good validation of the traditional Christian view, which I know you don't entirely share.
Well, I may share more of it than you imply. However, I think there is a deeper level. What are their motivations? Just hatred and jealousy?
Essentially hatred and jealousy, yeah. Mostly hatred of God, even though they've rebelled against God, and even though they are in no way sorry for what they did, interestingly. Nevertheless, they hate God, and so they hate man made in the image of God, and they are also trying to seduce people to corruption. They also seem to claim some legal rights over people. This is why the most dangerous thing for people to do is to get involved in the occult or dark arts. There was a woman I dealt with, and I write about in the book at length, who was possessed precisely because she was one of these rare Satanists.
Yep.
And so once someone has committed to something like that, it's a little bit like joining the mafia. Once you join the mafia, they never want to let you go. So once the demonic world has sort of done a favor for you at your bidding, sometimes, often, in these serious cases, they feel they have some legal right to you, so to speak.
Okay, I'm going to let Ben jump in here, too.
They can be very legalistic. So it's a combination of hate, sadism, entitlement. I mean, they regard us also as so much their inferiors. You know, and our intelligence is much less than theirs. I would say these creatures tend to be very intelligent, probably even more intelligent than Einstein. And they kind of regard us as little pets for them to play with, indirectly attempting to, yes, increase their realm, so to speak, and certainly increase their rebellion against God.
Ben?
I think I was really excited for this because I have a few friends that are in the Roman Catholic Seminary up here in Boston at St. John's. I even have a few friends over at the NAC over in Rome, and it's super interesting to me because I always find modern cosmology so fascinating. Growing up in the Eastern Orthodox Church, I always found it kind of interesting how like it was not that it was never talked about, but it was kind of like, who cares, right? Because when we say traditional, especially here in America, it's a lot of the Christian traditions that have immigrated to America, unfortunately, take on a lot of characteristics of what was here at the time, which would have been puritanical, Protestant, all this stuff. So a lot of the traditions were sort of changed and morphed and sort of took on whatever was there at the time. So I believe I listened to a lecture a while ago, ironically, on this topic, and basically the lecturer was Father Stephen DeYoung, who is a biblical scholar. And he was talking about how it's interesting how every generation of Christians, they'll sort of come up with their own sort of like way that demons exist. So for like, medieval, Western Christians, they were, these red things that poked people with sticks. And then you have like C.S. Lewis, who has bureaucrats, basically satanic bureaucrats, in screw tape letters. So when we say traditional, where does the tradition come from?
Well, I'm a professor of psychiatry, so the bulk of my work is as a standard psychiatrist. But I also teach at a seminary. And I would say that the traditional teaching, contrary to what you're implying, is been pretty consistent. Now, demons can appear in a lot of different forms and have done so. So they are able to materialize in different ways. That's precisely how they confuse people. So obviously, different cultures, different brands of Christianity are going to have slightly different opinions. But it all comes back essentially to revelation. And in the New Testament, there is no question that Jesus not only strongly taught about demons, but he made a major distinction between curing illnesses and curing possessions. So these were two different things.
Yes.
And so from very early in the church, they believed that Jesus had given the church the power to deliver people from demonic entities. And pretty much from the early church, it's always been taught, it's a more elaborate theology than in other religions, obviously, that these were fallen angels, because that's what Jesus taught. So it really does go back to what we think is revelation. There are different varieties of Christianity, different heterodox movements, so one can emphasize the difference, but certainly the main doctrine of the church in many ways has never really changed, and one has to take that into account too, amidst whatever diversity there obviously is within the Christian institutions.
Okay, well, why don't we take our mid-show break, You're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM, 99.5 FM in New England's beautiful Blackstone Valley. And we'll be right back with our tremendous guest, Dr. Richard Gallagher, so stick with us.
On Sunday, January 29th, join the volunteers of the St. Anne Arts and Cultural Center at Cellos in Woonsocket. Cellos will donate up to 20% of your check to the center. By participating, you could win a $10, $20, or $50 gift card to Cellos. A certificate is needed to participate and can be obtained at Belos Flowers, Creative Impressions, The Honey Shop, Little General on Cumberland Hill Road, Timeless Antiques, Vos True Value Hardware, or print from the St. Anne Arts and Cultural Center website.
Local and live at 99.5 FM.
And welcome back to Behind the Paranormal on WOON AM and FM radio. And let's get back to our discussion on exorcism and demons with Dr. Richard Gallagher. So, Ben, you had one more point.
So I'm not disagreeing with you, because I think there's an objective reality and we all experience it subjectively, right? You being in the Western Church, me being in the Eastern Church, we could use the same terminology for the same, or different terminology for the same things. And that's just unfortunately because of our two very different experiences. But I do want to point out that Christ also says in Scripture, he makes a very clear distinction between unclean spirits and demons. So when he refers to unclean spirits, what does he mean?
Well, again, I've worked with many Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox individuals and clergy as well, and I really don't think there is all that much difference between the two in the teachings in this area. I would say that when Jesus is talking about demons, which is a Greek word originally, and it sometimes was a broader concept, he really is essentially talking about unclean spirits. So, Ben, you're a smart guy, I know, but I do think he uses the terms synonymously.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to have to do like 8 or 10 shows here because we have so many questions and listeners are writing in even now. I think that I absolutely agree with the idea that there is a trigger, such as the occult. I mean, we've had case after case after case over the last 50-odd years of particularly kids using Ouija boards or doing seances, things of this kind, and it's a tremendous problem. So what triggers have you found in your cases, Doctor?
Well, essentially, you've characterized it as people turning to the occult, sometimes unwittingly, but people kind of get in over their head, and they don't quite understand what they're dealing with. Now, I'm sure there are some kids who, just fool around with a Ouija board, but ultimately, the point of a Ouija board is to access spirits. The famous case that lay behind the fictional version in The Exorcist was actually of a young boy, not a girl, in Maryland, and his aunt was a spiritualist. And after she died, he tried to contact her seriously by a Ouija board. So this would be an example of someone who was turning to the occult in a serious way. Obviously, there are people who even more seriously turn to the occult by actually becoming Satan worshipers, that sort of thing. Even that stuff is rare. I do think there are a fair amount of people who get in over their head dealing with the occult. A related way that people open a door, as it's often framed, is by engaging in very, very serious evil, which in a way is also playing on the ground of demonic forces. So you will see people turning to, rather serious, nefarious things in their life and or the occult. In some ways, what they're doing is, again, whether they're aware of it or not, is they're inviting in a darker realm, and that's really what opens up people to serious demonic attack, whether oppression or possession.
No, that is really.
I've seen that just so many times. It's practically universal.
Oh no, I tend to agree. There's always this theme of control. Yeah, it's like there's this idea that we can control the world around us through techniques, and it's sort of the opposite of prayer, right? Because prayer is sort of allowing things to be oriented the way they should be, versus effectively magic, right? Magic is my will be done rather than thy will be done. Do you find that trying to gain control of these sort of uncontrollable forces is kind of what leads down this path?
No, exactly, Ben. I agree with you 100%. Traditional Christian thinkers have always made a distinction between seeking God's help in various ways versus seeking magical help or help from alternate sources of forces in the universe. And the latter are people who get themselves in trouble.
Okay, let's go to some listener questions here. We have Peter Shelley from Bogota, Colombia. Ben, if you want to.
Yes, the omnipresent Peter writes to us. One of the symptoms said to indicate authentic possession is speaking in a foreign language such as Latin. Why should this be considered so unusual or supernatural if Catholic schools often teach Latin? Fun fact, I did not. I went to Catholic school all my life. I weren't alert of Latin, or weren't alert of a word of Latin. Jeez. Actually, you taught me some Latin. But other than that,
yeah,
I never learned Latin.
That's a long story.
Well, it's an understandable question, but you got to remember in these cases, the traditional signs that there is a foreign entity. That's really what you're talking about. Is there evidence of a foreign intelligence that is manifesting itself in some way? I mean, these cases of someone speaking perfect Latin or other languages as well, and I've heard many different languages spoken by demons, it has to be dramatic. They have to have a knowledge of the language that goes far beyond what someone, just picked up here and there over the years in a Catholic school or something. I tell people, sometimes people say, well, how come they speak Latin? How come this only happens in, Christian people or something? Nothing could be further from the truth. Possessions have occurred all throughout history. Probably the leading chronicler of possessions was a gentleman named Professor Osterreich, who was a German professor, an agnostic, by the way, who about 100 years ago gave evidence of cases of dramatic possessions in all cultures throughout history, albeit rarely. So my own experience with demons speaking languages is they speak that language perfectly. They've never studied it. I mean, you have to use your common sense there. You're not talking about people who were exposed to it by their nanny or something like that. These are people who are never exposed to the language and then all of a sudden speak the language fluently. I remember I was at one exorcism and the demon through the woman was speaking a vaguely Slavic language, and none of us understood it. And then the priest said to us after the exorcism was concluded, the demon was talking to me in Bulgarian because I know Bulgarian. So almost incredible to contemplate. These demons have been observing human beings from the dawn of history. They're very smart. They actually can speak any language. And in addition, you're looking for other signs. You're looking for incredibly abnormal movements, like a levitation, for instance. You're looking for superhuman strength. I dealt with a woman who had a Lutheran deacon, relatively inexperienced start to do prayers over her, and he was like a 200-pound guy. She was about 90 pounds, soaking wet, and she threw him across the room. That ended that session. I've also had people reveal all kinds of hidden knowledge, including about how people died that she had never known. This Satanist woman that I talked about, again, the rare Satanist type, she told me how my mother died of ovarian cancer. Now, she would have no way of knowing that. That happened years earlier. So the long and the short of it is you have to have clear evidence of a foreign entity. You know, these diagnoses are very rigorous when well done. I mean, that's part of the reason they bring me in as a psychiatrist. It's as rigorous as any science. It's as rigorous as any medical diagnosis, and the manifestations, whether it's languages or superhuman strength or hidden knowledge or some of the more bizarre stuff like a levitation. I've talked to about 35 people in my life. I've never seen a levitation, but I've talked to about 35 people in my life who claim that they either saw or experienced, while in a possessed state, a levitation.
I've seen it.
I often say to people, Paul and Ben, I often say to people, how many mentally ill patients do you know that all of a sudden can levitate or speak perfect Latin? Well, I'm a professor of psychiatry. I've never seen that in a patient.
I must say I'm a little rusty with my levitation. Have you found that in modern times anyway that the number of possessions has increased, decreased, stayed the same? Are there any sort of significant explosions in activity?
It's a very good question. Like a lot of good questions, it doesn't really have a simple answer. I mean, the short answer is we don't really know. I mean, it's not like there's a worldwide registry of this stuff. The perception is in the Western world, while more people have turned away from, I would say, mainstream and traditional religions, Orthodox religions of different sorts, that more people have opened themselves up to neo-pagan, alternate spiritualities that are sometimes have a dark side, and that there probably are more of these cases. Other people feel it's that because of all the publicity about possessions in the Western world, the movies, etc. I mean, look at the fact that we're talking about this on a major show, you guys' show. So more people are aware of that. So you may have more people fooled into believing that their problems, which may well be mental, are caused by demons. I would say in the rest of the world, it's probably a little bit different. I mean, I know people from Africa, and they say there's always been possessions there because there's always been a lot of flirtation with sort of dark forces in various types of paganism.
Okay. Just to add one point to your excellent description of how you judge whether possession is taking place, and you mentioned this in the book as well, we would always look for external phenomena taking place, in my case, in the state hospital in upstate New York. You know, things flying off shelves and physical objects moving that otherwise would not. So that's just to add to the point here. Okay, now we have, do we have a second question from Peter?
We do.
Actually, let's wait a minute.
Oh.
We're burning up this hour so quickly. I wanted to give Dr. Gallagher a chance to talk about his book, which I have right here, and where people can find out more.
Well, like everything else, Paul, I didn't really volunteer to write a book. I was asked to write a book. I was asked to join the International Association of Exorcists. Believe it or not, I was asked to make a movie about some of the things in the book, which will be coming out eventually. And I was delighted that HarperCollins allowed me to write the book that I wanted to write. I wanted to write a serious book with a lot of fascinating and enthralling details. but aimed essentially at the educated reader. I'll give you an example of a reaction I got from a reader after reading the book, because I tried to present the evidence in a serious way. And this was a guy I had known since I was intern in internal medicine, and he was a colleague of mine, and he was a good friend of mine, actually. But it's not like over the years I would go around talking about this stuff with everybody, including even a close friend. And so he called me up one day and he said, Rich, I read your book. How come you never told me about it? And I said, well, Cliff, I don't go around talking about it to everybody. And I said, what did you think? And now he had a Jewish background. He was a good guy. He had a vague belief in God, but he certainly wasn't brought up religious. And he said, Rich, you cannot read this book without concluding that a very serious thinker, I said thanks for the compliment, he said that a very serious thinker has made a strong case that there is evidence, including in the modern world, for evil spirits. And that's exactly the reader that I wanted to have, the person who's a searcher, like a lot of listeners to your show, I'm sure, the person who's a searcher, who tries to be objective, but who keeps an open mind. And, the essence of the argument is, look, there are many, many people, thousands throughout history, even if uncommon, who have claimed to be attacked by invisible spirits. And they've been attacked by these sort of invisible spirits. Now, if you can't call an attack by an invisible spirit an evil spirit, I say in the book, words lose their meaning. It's obviously some kind of demonic figure. So I wrote the book for that type of person mainly. I also wrote it for people who may be confused about this whole subject. Many clergy have said it's been very helpful to them. But I basically wrote it at the level of the educated reader. HarperCollins published it. It's selling very well by the grace of God. I'm not particularly materialistic, but I'm glad that I got my message out. And, of course, it's available on Amazon and most bookstores.
Very good. Okay, we have a question from Phil in Savannah, Georgia. And bear in mind, Doctor, that he's using sort of our terms and our point of view. And we are, I think, maybe more in agreement than you think, but when we get into the process, that's what I'm curious about how this would work and the impressions I got during these situations. Maybe the physics, things of that kind, and how the knowledge is obtained, all that sort of thing. So, Ben, if you would be so kind.
Sure thing.
Phil in Savannah.
Okie dokie. Phil writes to us, the Catholic Church seems to be the religious branch that is most associated with exorcisms, although I imagine that most priests don't know what they are doing. His words. My question is, if a parasitical entity from another corner of the multiverse is messing with a human, why does the Church think the entity would care or react to the priest's definition of theology? It would be as if the entity told us we had to honor his deity, whoever, and would be like, and we would be like, who is that?
Well, I'm familiar, Paul. You nicely sent me your book, and I'm familiar with some of your ideas about parasitic entities and, you might say, the physicality of this. There's no question that these entities do prey on people. Whether to call them true parasites, I think, is a question of semantics. And they can affect the material world, but essentially they're spiritual beings. I think the Catholic Church, as well as the Eastern Orthodox Church for that matter, have been the most faithful institutions. I mean, I know many wonderful Protestant people in the deliverance field too. So I'm certainly not criticizing non-Orthodox and non-Catholic practitioners. But I think the most experienced people in this field tend to be Orthodox and Catholic clergy. They also have the most systematic theology. They also have the most experience and ritualized, manualized, you might say, ways of dealing with these people. So, I think they're the best people to be in a knowledgeable position to understand them. Obviously, there's all kinds of issues about what's the true religion and all that. I don't think we're going to get into it in this show, but
no, of course not.
I do think that the way that the church has understood this theology is the most accurate way. That doesn't mean that people who are possessed necessarily, are expected to pay obeisance to a particular theology. But as I said earlier in the show, my own experience has been that during these successful exorcisms, the demon is essentially forced to submit. The reason you make a big deal about naming the demon is not so much that it's some kind of magical token of success. It's that these demons try to hide. They've tried to hide throughout all history. They've tried to pretend to be Nero or Judas Iscariot, or I had a guy who was possessed who pretended to be the spirit pretended to be Zeus, believe it or not.
Gee.
He asked me if I wanted to speak to Zeus. I declined. But what I'm saying, guys, is that when the exorcism is successful, and it is in most cases, not always, because not always does everyone turn back to God, but when the exorcism is clearly having good results, these spirits are forced to admit who they are, and in my experience, they admit that they're demons with the attendant theology of having been fallen angels.
I think that there's a really important quote that I really like from G.K. Chesterton, which is, we need to think mythologically. And I say mythologically with the caveat to a little asterisk that mythology refers to us existing in a story. We participate in a story, and this sort of new, well, I won't say new idea, but this sort of more pervasive idea that's been kind of coming around in philosophical circles is the idea of this metaphorical truth, that there's sort of these patterns throughout history that we've just sort of been repeating over and over again. So when we say history repeats itself, it's not like a tongue-in-cheek thing like, we knew you were going to mess up, but it's the patterns that we as humans find ourselves in always. And we find ourselves as part of a story always. And, it's why we have these things called they're trying to spin on narrative. They're trying to, do this. And I believe it might have been George Orwell who said, he who controls the language controls the world. And so in this instance, the sort of the pattern throughout history, this has always been a thing. It's always been around. Nothing's changed really. And my sort of question is the future. Do you find that, especially in recent history, with the dawn of artificial intelligence and sort of this whole sort of new nexus of thinking, of trying to sort of find new ways to control the world around us, whether it's building almost a literal god, that's going to be, in charge of ethics and whatnot in Silicon Valley, or anything like that. How is this any different than biblical times, or is it no different?
Look, Ben, you asked very sophisticated questions, so it's hard to have much of a discussion of it in a few minutes. You're using the word mythological in a more sophisticated sense. Most people use the word mythological, as you know, meaning sort of made up. But these different narratives, you might say, or overall ways of understanding the cosmos, including in more symbolic or non-literal language, has always existed and will always exist. People are sometimes surprised to hear that some people characterize the Adam and Eve story and Genesis as having a historical truth to it, but also then having non-literal elements to it. And people are surprised when I point out that even the great Orthodox theologian, St. Augustine, 1,500 years ago, wrote a book called On the Non-Literal Interpretation of Genesis. And he said, the Bible is not a scientific book. It's often historical, especially in the New Testament, but it's not meant to be a scientific book such that it's childish to think that every element of Genesis was meant literally. Getting back to your question about the future, I mean, there's always going to be different ways people interpret the world, and they do have to come up with different metaphors or call it myths that are often sort of figments of their wishful imagination. I do believe that the Christian narrative, including the Creed, as well as the findings of Revelation, they're not dying out, and I don't think they ever will die out. So I think there's enough in the Christian narrative that will be forever and universally accepted. However, people challenge that. I mean, some people will say, some so-called biblical scholars, and many biblical scholars are quite naive. They will say, Jesus' teachings about demons was anachronistic. It was just using the mistaken view of the time. This was a symbolic way of talking about evil. I think a close reading of the Gospels, a common sense view, is that that's nonsense. That he clearly sometimes cured sick people, sometimes drove out demons, and he absolutely not only made a distinction between that, but literally felt he was dealing with evil spirits. So there's always going to be mythological thinking, but to quote Chesterton again, the Christian stories seem to be when the myths came alive and became true. That's another quote from Chesterton.
Well, Doctor, I'm afraid we're just about out of time. If you would so honor us, we would love to have you back on a regular basis, if only to get through all these questions.
Well, I'd be happy to do so. I have a very definite viewpoint, which I think, as both a professor of psychiatry and a professor at a seminary, I think I can back up. So if you guys can, I respect your guys' view, and if you can respect the views of a fairly traditional Christian, let's continue the dialogue.
Absolutely. Respect is the operative word.
There is always more to learn.
That's how we learn, exactly. Well, Dr. Richard Gallagher, thank you so much. And Ben, let's move on to our announcements, if we could, please.
Sure thing. Now for something completely different. You can look for us at the New England Parafest in Kittery, Maine. That's on April 22nd and 23rd, and we will debut a presentation on mimics in the paranormal.
And we'll be at the Para Expo 2023 aboard the USS Salem at Quincy, Massachusetts, May 19th, 21st. We'll be among the speakers and will broadcast live from the ship on Sunday, May 21st. At this event, we will debut a new presentation, When We Die. Real cheerful. Other events in 2023 for which we or I will be present include the Exeter UFO Festival in September and the Arizona Dowsers Conference in October.
And you can visit our show website. That's www.behindtheparanormal.com, where you can find over 1,100 hours of our regular shows and special broadcasts since 2008 from CBS Radio, Achieve Radio, and here on WOON, AM, and FM. Also hear many of these broadcasts on major podcast platforms up to and including iTunes, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify.
Okay, well, what do we have for next week, Ben?
Well, the first week of February, geez, already powering through the month, huh?
Time flies when you're having fun.
Indeed. So on February 5th, we'll welcome Dr. Simeon Hine for a look at dark matter monsters, who Bigfoot sightings are often accompanied by other paranormal phenomena. You can plan to call in or get your questions to us at paul@behindtheparanormal.com.
And we leave you today with a rather sobering thought from the man whose memory we honored in last week's show, Nigel Kerner, the late Nigel Kerner. The terrifying thing is that most of us just cannot see the size of our predicament, unquote. I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno. And thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey, and we shall see you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.